Picture yourself in a candle-lit palace chamber in 1771. The silk curtains are drawn tight against prying eyes, the air thick with the scent of rosewater and fear. You're 20 years old, a queen, and you're pregnant. But there's a problem that keeps you awake every night. A secret that could topple kingdoms and cost you your head. You have absolutely no idea which of your three lovers is the father of the child growing inside you. Was it your husband, the king? The mentally unstable man you're legally bound to but can barely stand to touch? Was it the royal physician who's been visiting your private chambers 3 times a week, the man you actually love? Or was it that dashing court favorite who's caught between loyalty to the king and desire for you? In 7 months, you'll give birth to a child who might inherit a throne, and the uncertainty could destroy everything: your crown, your freedom, your life. This was the reality for Queen Caroline Matilda of Great Britain, one of the most tragic and scandalous figures in European royal history. A teenage princess shipped off to Denmark to marry a mad king, who fell desperately in love with the wrong man, became pregnant in circumstances that shocked all of Europe, and paid the ultimate price for daring to seek happiness in a world that demanded only duty. Her story isn't just about forbidden love or royal scandal. It's about a woman trapped in an impossible situation who made choices that seemed like survival until those choices destroyed her. Tonight, I'm taking you deep into the most intimate and dangerous corners of 18th century royal life, where pregnancy could be a political weapon or a death sentence, where paternity was determined by power rather than biology, and where one young queen's desperate search for love triggered a revolution that would reshape an entire kingdom. To bring you this story, I've spent months researching personal letters between Caroline Matilda and her lover preserved in Danish royal archives, diplomatic dispatches from British ambassadors who reported every scandalous detail back to London, court records from the sensational trial that exposed her affair, medical examinations that questioned the paternity of her children, and modern historical analysis that reveals just how calculated, or how reckless, her choices really were. What emerged was a woman far more complex than history remembers. Not just a victim of circumstance, but a strategic player in deadly court politics who understood that in her world, producing an heir mattered more than who actually fathered that heir. Over the next 30 minutes, we'll journey through Caroline Matilda's extraordinary and heartbreaking life. Her childhood as a British princess who never expected to leave England. Her teenage marriage to one of Europe's most unstable monarchs. Her isolation in a foreign court that despised her. Her passionate affair with the royal physician who became Denmark's de facto ruler. The pregnancy that everyone whispered about. The baby whose paternity was questioned from the moment of birth. The violent coup that tore her from her children. And her tragic early death in exile, destroyed by a scandal she never fully escaped. By the end, you'll understand why Caroline Matilda's story still matters more than 200 years later. You'll see how pregnancy and paternity became weapons in political warfare. And you'll never think about royal legitimacy, or the impossible choices women faced, the same way again. Before we step into the glittering but treacherous world of 18th century Danish court politics, hit subscribe if you love deep dives into royal history's darkest and most scandalous corners. We post weekly about the shocking truths history tried to bury. Drop a comment telling me, have you ever heard of Queen Caroline Matilda, or has her story been completely forgotten? Your likes help us uncover more lost royal scandals. Now, let's travel back to 1751, to the birth of a princess who would become one of history's most controversial queens. Caroline Matilda was born on July 22, 1751, at Leicester House in London, the 9th and youngest child of Frederick, Prince of Wales, and Princess Augusta of Saxe-Gotha. She never knew her father. He had died 3 months before her birth, leaving her mother to raise 9 children alone while navigating the treacherous waters of the British court. Her older brother would eventually become King George III, one of Britain's longest reigning and most controversial monarchs. But for young Caroline Matilda, royal life meant something entirely different. She was a spare, a bargaining chip, a princess whose primary value lay in who she could be married off to. Growing up in Georgian England, Caroline Matilda received the education typical for royal princesses of the era: languages, music, dancing, needlework, and just enough history and religion to make polite conversation. She was described by contemporaries as lively, intelligent, and possessed of considerable natural charm. She had striking features: the characteristic Hanoverian blue eyes, fair hair, and a spirited personality that set her apart from her more reserved siblings. But beneath the surface education and courtly manners, no one prepared her for what royal marriage actually meant: political isolation, cultural alienation, and the crushing pressure to produce heirs regardless of personal happiness or marital compatibility. In 1765, when Caroline Matilda was just 14 years old, her fate was sealed. Negotiations began for her marriage to her cousin, King Christian VII of Denmark. On paper, it seemed like a brilliant match. She would be a queen, ruling alongside a king of a wealthy and powerful Nordic kingdom. The Danish court was known for its sophistication, its wealth, and its strategic importance in northern European politics. For Britain, the alliance strengthened ties with Denmark and created a counterbalance to growing Russian and Swedish influence in the Baltic region. For Caroline Matilda, it meant leaving everything she knew to marry a 17-year-old cousin she'd never met. What no one told the teenage princess, or what they deliberately concealed, was that Christian VII was deeply, irreversibly mentally ill. On October 1, 1766, 15-year-old Caroline Matilda arrived in Denmark to marry a king she'd never seen. The wedding took place just days later, on November 8, at Christiansborg Palace in Copenhagen, a lavish affair with all the pageantry expected of a royal wedding. Caroline Matilda wore cloth of silver, her hair dressed with diamonds, playing her part perfectly as the gracious young queen. Christian VII, just 18 years old, appeared handsome in his ceremonial robes, every inch the young monarch. To outside observers, they made a perfect royal couple. The reality was a nightmare from the wedding night onward. Christian VII suffered from what modern historians believe was a combination of schizophrenia, severe anxiety disorder, and possibly bipolar disorder, all exacerbated by a traumatic childhood filled with physical and psychological abuse from his tutors. He was erratic, paranoid, subject to violent mood swings and bizarre behavior. He would stay awake for days, then sleep for 24 hours straight. He experienced hallucinations and delusions. He inflicted self-harm, hitting himself and sometimes others. He was obsessed with prostitutes and low company, preferring the brothels of Copenhagen to the refined atmosphere of his own court. And he was terrified of his young bride. The wedding night was reportedly a disaster. Christian, anxious and unstable, could barely fulfill his marital duties. Contemporary accounts suggest he was rough, frightened, and completely unable to provide the tenderness a 15-year-old girl needed. After that first night, he largely avoided Caroline Matilda's chambers, preferring the company of his male favorites and the prostitutes he regularly brought into the palace. When he did visit her, it was perfunctory, mechanical, and brief, hardly the foundation for either emotional connection or reliable conception. Caroline Matilda found herself in an impossible position. She was a queen in title but had no real influence. The Danish court, dominated by conservative nobles who resented foreign influence, viewed her with suspicion and barely concealed contempt. She didn't speak Danish fluently yet. She had no allies, no friends, no one to confide in. Her husband ignored her except when protocol demanded otherwise. And she had one overwhelming, crushing responsibility: produce an heir to secure the succession. Everything depended on getting pregnant by a husband who could barely stand to be in the same room with her. The court watched her with vulture-like attention. Every month, there was speculation. Was the queen pregnant? Had the king visited her chambers? Courtiers counted days, calculated cycles, and whispered constantly about the state of the royal marriage. For Caroline Matilda, this surveillance was suffocating. She was a teenager trapped in a foreign country, married to a madman, surrounded by enemies, with her every bodily function a matter of state interest. Somehow, against all odds, she became pregnant in early 1767. Whether through one of Christian's rare visits or through sheer determination and careful timing, Caroline Matilda conceived. The court erupted in celebration when the pregnancy was announced. Finally, the young queen had fulfilled her primary duty. On January 28, 1768, after a difficult labor, she delivered a son, Crown Prince Frederick. The birth secured Caroline Matilda's position, temporarily. She had produced the crucial male heir. Denmark had its succession. She had done her duty, but it also revealed just how little she mattered beyond her reproductive function. Within hours of the birth, the baby was taken from her and placed in the care of royal nurses and governors. She would have limited access to her own son, who was now property of the state, not truly hers at all. And Christian, rather than being grateful or affectionate, became even more distant and erratic. For the next 2 years, Caroline Matilda lived in miserable isolation. She was 20 years old, a mother who couldn't raise her child, a wife to a husband who despised her, a queen with no power. She spent her days riding horses, the one freedom she was permitted, and her nights alone in her apartments, effectively imprisoned in golden luxury. Depression set in. Contemporary observers noted that she often appeared melancholy, withdrawn, aged beyond her years. She was wasting away, slowly suffocating under the weight of duty without purpose, position without power. Then, in 1769, everything changed. Christian VII hired a new royal physician. His name was Johann Friedrich Struensee. Johann Friedrich Struensee was 30 years old when he entered Caroline Matilda's life, and he was everything Christian VII was not. Handsome, charismatic, highly educated, and supremely confident, Struensee came from a German family of physicians and intellectuals. He was well-read in Enlightenment philosophy, a follower of Voltaire and Rousseau, a believer in rational reform and progressive politics. He spoke multiple languages fluently, including excellent English, which Caroline Matilda still preferred. And unlike the sycophantic Danish nobles, he treated the young queen with respect, intelligence, and genuine interest. Christian VII, despite his madness, recognized that Struensee had a rare talent. He could calm the king's anxiety attacks, manage his episodes, and keep him functional enough to maintain the appearance of royal authority. Within months, Struensee became indispensable to Christian, appointed as royal physician and given unprecedented access to the king at all hours. He accompanied Christian everywhere, managed his schedule, and essentially controlled who had access to the monarch. This included access to the queen. At first, the relationship between Caroline Matilda and Struensee was purely professional. He treated her occasional ailments, prescribed remedies for her melancholy, and provided her with the intellectual conversation she desperately craved. For a woman starved of intelligent companionship, Struensee's attention was intoxicating. He discussed philosophy, politics, and literature with her. He brought her books banned at the conservative Danish court. He treated her not as a breeding vessel or a decorative figurehead, but as an intelligent human being with thoughts and opinions that mattered. The attraction was inevitable. Caroline Matilda was 20 years old, beautiful, trapped in a loveless marriage, and desperately lonely. Struensee was handsome, brilliant, attentive, and increasingly powerful. By late 1769, their relationship had transformed from professional courtesy to something far more dangerous. They began meeting privately. Struensee's apartments were moved directly adjacent to the queen's chambers, connected by a private passage. He visited her multiple times daily, often staying for hours. The court noticed immediately and began whispering. But here's what made the situation extraordinary. Christian VII either didn't notice, didn't care, or actively approved. The king was so dependent on Struensee for managing his condition that he granted his physician essentially unlimited freedom. Some historians believe Christian may have even understood that Struensee and Caroline Matilda were conducting an affair and tacitly permitted it, either out of indifference to his wife or gratitude to the man who kept him functional. The king, the queen, and the physician formed a bizarre triangle at the center of Danish power, with Struensee increasingly making decisions that should have been the king's alone. By 1770, Struensee wasn't just the queen's lover, he was effectively ruling Denmark. Using his control over the king, he pushed through a stunning series of progressive reforms that transformed Danish governance. He abolished torture and improved the treatment of prisoners. He introduced freedom of the press, making Denmark one of the first European countries to eliminate censorship. He reformed the tax system to reduce the burden on peasants. He reorganized the government, firing corrupt officials and streamlining bureaucracy. He challenged the power of the nobility and the church, both of which had dominated Danish politics for centuries. These reforms were revolutionary, literally. They anticipated many of the changes that would come with the French Revolution 2 decades later, but they also made Struensee incredibly dangerous enemies. Conservative nobles watched with horror as this foreign upstart physician seized power. The church condemned his Enlightenment ideas as atheistic and immoral, and everyone noticed what was impossible to hide. Struensee and the queen were lovers. Caroline Matilda didn't hide her feelings well. For the first time since arriving in Denmark, she was happy. She glowed with an energy and vitality she'd never shown during her miserable first years in Copenhagen. She consulted with Struensee on state matters, effectively acting as his political partner. She appeared with him publicly at court functions, often more attentive to him than to her own husband. She rode with him daily, their horses side by side through the royal parks. She laughed at his jokes, touched his arm in conversation, and looked at him with undisguised affection. The court gossip became impossible to ignore. Diplomatic dispatches sent back to foreign capitals openly discussed the queen's affair. Courtiers made crude jokes. Pamphlets circulated in Copenhagen depicting Struensee and Caroline Matilda in compromising positions, with Christian shown as a cuckold. The situation was becoming a massive scandal, threatening not just personal reputations, but the legitimacy of the Danish monarchy itself. And then, in May 1770, Caroline Matilda announced she was pregnant again. When news of the Queen's pregnancy spread through the Danish court, it triggered an immediate crisis of whispered speculation. The question everyone asked, but few dared voice openly, was devastatingly simple. Who is the father? Officially, of course, the father was King Christian VII. The pregnancy occurred during the royal marriage. The king had occasional access to the queen's chambers. By law, any child born to a queen during marriage was presumed to be the legitimate heir of the king. That was the public position, and to question it was treason. But privately, everyone calculated the timing and reached the same conclusion. Christian VII had barely visited Caroline Matilda's chambers during the conception window. He was increasingly unstable, often incapacitated by his mental illness, and spent most of his time with male companions or prostitutes. Meanwhile, Struensee had daily, often hourly access to the queen. They were together constantly. The pregnancy coincided perfectly with the intensification of their affair. Caroline Matilda herself may not have been entirely certain. This is the horrifying reality for women in her position. If you're sleeping with multiple men, even if one is your husband out of duty and another is your lover out of desire, determining paternity with absolute certainty is impossible without modern science. She knew the child was most likely Struensee's based on timing and frequency of encounters. But there remained a sliver of doubt, a possibility that Christian could be the biological father. And that sliver of doubt was everything. As long as uncertainty existed, as long as it was plausible that Christian could be the father, the child could be presented as legitimate. This was the game Caroline Matilda had to play perfectly. Maintain enough ambiguity to preserve the fiction of royal legitimacy, while privately knowing the truth was far more complicated. The pregnancy proceeded amid mounting tension. Struensee, now at the peak of his power, continued his reforms and essentially governed Denmark while Christian descended further into madness. Caroline Matilda, visibly pregnant and visibly in love with Struensee, made little effort to hide her happiness. She appeared at his side at state functions. She consulted with him on political matters. She made clear to everyone that Struensee was more than just a royal physician. He was her partner in governance, and everyone suspected in her bed. Conservative nobles watched this situation with growing rage. Not only was a foreign physician ruling their country and pushing through radical reforms, but he was also openly cuckolding their king and potentially fathering royal bastards who might inherit the throne. The situation was intolerable. They began plotting a coup. On July 7, 1771, at Hirschholm Palace outside Copenhagen, Caroline Matilda went into labor. The birth was attended by midwives and physicians, but notably Struensee was present, an unusual arrangement that raised more eyebrows. After several hours of labor, the queen delivered a healthy baby girl, Princess Louise Augusta. The infant's appearance immediately triggered speculation. She bore no resemblance to the royal family. She had dark hair while both Caroline Matilda and Christian were fair. Her features seemed to mirror Struensee's. Even Christian VII, in one of his more lucid moments, reportedly looked at the baby and asked, "Are you certain this child is mine?" But again, certainty didn't matter, plausibility did. The child was born during the Queen's marriage. She was officially recognized as Princess Louise Augusta of Denmark, legitimate daughter of King Christian VII and Queen Caroline Matilda. That was the legal reality, regardless of biological truth. Caroline Matilda had successfully navigated the paternity uncertainty and secured her position further, or so she thought. She had produced a male heir with her first pregnancy, probably Christian's biological son, and now a daughter with her second, almost certainly Struensee's biological daughter. She had fulfilled her reproductive duty while also pursuing the love and partnership she'd been denied in her arranged marriage. But her happiness would last less than 6 months. The conservative nobles had seen enough. The revolution was coming. The night of January 16-17, 1772, would become the most infamous date in Danish royal history. While King Christian VII attended a masquerade ball at Christiansborg Palace in Copenhagen, a group of conservative nobles led by Queen Dowager Juliana Maria, Christian's stepmother, staged a carefully planned coup. They waited until after midnight when the ball was at its height and security was relaxed. Then they struck. First, they arrested Struensee. Guards seized him in his apartments, the apartments directly connected to the Queen's chambers, and dragged him away in chains. He was charged with treason, usurpation of royal authority, and lèse-majesty, crimes against the monarch. But everyone knew the real charge: adultery with the Queen. Next, they went for Caroline Matilda. Soldiers burst into the Queen's private chambers at 3 a.m., waking her from sleep. They informed her she was under arrest by order of the king. She demanded to see Christian, but he was being held by the conspirators, who had convinced him to sign arrest warrants in a moment of confusion and fear. Caroline Matilda, still in her nightclothes, was forcibly taken from the palace. She never saw her children again. Caroline Matilda was transported immediately to Kronborg Castle, famous as the setting of Shakespeare's Hamlet, where she was imprisoned in isolated apartments. 7-month-old Princess Louise Augusta was taken from her mother's arms during the arrest. 3-year-old Crown Prince Frederick, her son, was already living separately under royal governors. Both children were declared wards of the state and removed entirely from their mother's custody. For Caroline Matilda, this separation was perhaps worse than imprisonment itself. She was a mother whose children had been stolen. She would never hold her daughter again. She would never see her son grow up. The cruelty of removing infants from their mothers was a deliberate tactic of royal punishment, designed to break women emotionally in ways that physical imprisonment alone could not. Meanwhile, the conspirators set about destroying Struensee and extracting a confession that would prove the affair. They subjected him to torture, the very practice he had abolished during his reform period. Under extreme physical and psychological pressure, Struensee eventually confessed to criminal intimacy with the Queen. He admitted the affair. He acknowledged that he had overstepped his position. He was forced to provide details about their relationship that would be used to humiliate and destroy Caroline Matilda. The trial was pure political theater. Struensee was convicted of treason and lèse-majesty. On April 28, 1772, he was executed in Copenhagen in front of a massive crowd. The method was deliberately brutal. He was first beheaded, then his body was drawn and quartered, with the pieces displayed publicly as a warning. His crime wasn't really the political reforms or even the usurpation of power. It was sleeping with the Queen and potentially fathering a royal child. That was the unforgivable transgression that required such savage punishment. Caroline Matilda, imprisoned in Kronborg Castle, learned of her lover's execution through her captors, who seemed to take pleasure in describing the gruesome details. She was then presented with a choice: confess to adultery and accept divorce, or face trial herself, which could result in execution. She initially refused, maintaining her innocence and her rights as queen. But she was a 21-year-old woman completely alone, imprisoned, separated from her children, and informed that her brother, King George III of Britain, had abandoned her to her fate. The British government, embarrassed by the scandal, was doing nothing to help her. She had no allies, no hope, no options. After weeks of psychological pressure, Caroline Matilda signed a confession admitting to criminal conversation with Struensee. In exchange, her life would be spared. She would be divorced from Christian VII, stripped of her title as Queen of Denmark, and exiled from the country. She would never see her children again. Princess Louise Augusta, the daughter everyone believed was Struensee's biological child, would remain officially legitimate as a Danish princess. The conservatives couldn't bastardize her without admitting the cuckoldry of their king, which would be too humiliating for the monarchy. On May 30, 1772, Caroline Matilda was transported by ship from Denmark to Celle in Hanover, then ruled by her brother George III as elector. She would spend the remaining 3 years of her life there, in comfortable but permanent exile, forbidden from returning to Denmark or seeing her children ever again. The castle of Celle became Caroline Matilda's prison for the final years of her short life. It wasn't a dungeon. She had comfortable apartments, servants, and the freedom to walk in the castle gardens. But it was still imprisonment. She was 21 years old, divorced, disgraced, and utterly alone. The woman who had briefly been one of the most powerful figures in Denmark was now a royal embarrassment, hidden away in a German castle to be forgotten. Contemporary accounts describe Caroline Matilda during this period as melancholy, withdrawn, and aged far beyond her 21 years. She spent hours staring out windows. She wrote constant letters to her brother George III, begging to see her children, pleading for some intervention that would reunite her with Crown Prince Frederick and Princess Louise Augusta. Her letters went largely unanswered. George III, deeply conservative and embarrassed by his sister's scandal, wanted nothing to do with her situation. Caroline Matilda became obsessed with news from Denmark. She demanded updates about her children's health and upbringing. She learned that Princess Louise Augusta, now just a toddler, was being raised at the Danish court as a legitimate princess, with no public acknowledgement of the paternity questions. She learned that Crown Prince Frederick was being groomed to eventually take the throne, deliberately kept away from any mention of his mother. The Danish court had erased her completely, as if she had never existed. She also learned that the conservative nobles who had staged the coup were systematically dismantling every reform Struensee had implemented. Freedom of the press was revoked. The torture of prisoners was reinstated. The tax reforms were reversed. Everything that she and Struensee had tried to build, a more enlightened, more humane Denmark, was being destroyed. The brief Enlightenment moment was over, crushed by conservative backlash. In early May 1775, Caroline Matilda fell ill with scarlet fever, a common and often deadly infection in the 18th century. Given her young age and generally good health, she should have recovered, but contemporary accounts suggest she had lost the will to live. She was 23 years old, exiled from her children, stripped of her title, her lover executed, her legacy destroyed. What was there to fight for? On May 10, 1775, just 3 years after her exile began, Caroline Matilda died at Celle Castle. She was 23 years old. The official cause was scarlet fever, though some historians have suspected she may have been poisoned, a convenient way to permanently silence an embarrassing scandal. There's no definitive evidence either way, but the timing was certainly convenient for those who wanted her forgotten. Her death barely registered in Denmark. No period of official mourning was declared. No tributes were paid. The woman who had been queen for 6 years was erased from history as quickly as possible. She was buried quietly in Celle, far from the children she'd been forbidden to see. But the story doesn't end with Caroline Matilda's death. It continues with her daughter, Princess Louise Augusta. The child everyone believed was Struensee's biological daughter, the living proof of the affair that had scandalized Europe. Louise Augusta grew up at the Danish court as an official princess, daughter of King Christian VII, legitimate member of the royal family. But she also grew up knowing, or at least hearing constant whispers, about her questionable paternity. Court gossips never stopped speculating. Diplomatic reports from foreign ambassadors continued to refer to her as probably Struensee's daughter. She looked nothing like the royal family, and strikingly like the executed physician whose portrait still survived in private collections. In 1786, at age 15, Louise Augusta was married off to Prince Frederick Christian II of Augustenburg. The marriage was arranged specifically to get her out of the Danish succession and away from Copenhagen, where her presence was a constant reminder of the scandal. She lived quietly in Augustenburg, bore several children, and died in 1843 at age 71, having survived her mother by nearly 7 decades. Modern historians have extensively debated Louise Augusta's paternity. Based on timing, access, and physical resemblance, the overwhelming consensus is that Struensee was indeed her biological father. Recent proposals to conduct DNA testing on Struensee's remains and Louise Augusta's descendants have been discussed, but never implemented, largely because the Danish royal family has no interest in officially confirming what everyone already suspects. Crown Prince Frederick, Caroline Matilda's son, eventually became King Frederick VI of Denmark in 1808 and ruled for 31 years. He was almost certainly Christian VII's biological son based on timing and resemblance. Unlike his sister, his paternity was never seriously questioned. He knew about his mother's fate, though how much detail he received is unclear. He never publicly rehabilitated her memory or acknowledged the injustice of her treatment. Caroline Matilda's story is fundamentally about the impossible position of royal women in the 18th century, and the deadly serious question of paternity in an era before any scientific method could resolve it. She was a teenage girl married off to a mentally ill stranger, expected to produce heirs with a husband who could barely function, isolated in a foreign court that hated her, and then condemned when she sought companionship and love elsewhere. The paternity question surrounding Princess Louise Augusta wasn't an abstract historical curiosity. It was a crisis that triggered political revolution, cost lives, and reshaped Danish governance. The fact that everyone suspected the baby wasn't Christian VII's biological child, but couldn't prove it definitively created an impossible situation. The conservatives couldn't officially bastardize Louise Augusta without admitting their king had been cuckolded, which would humiliate the monarchy. So they maintained the legal fiction of legitimacy, while punishing the mother savagely for the adultery everyone knew had occurred. This is what makes Caroline Matilda's story so significant. It reveals how paternity in royal courts was ultimately about power, not biology. Louise Augusta was legitimate because the Danish crown declared her legitimate, regardless of biological reality. The question of who actually fathered her mattered less than who had the political power to control the narrative. Caroline Matilda wielded the only power available to her, her fertility and her sexuality. She produced the required male heir, probably her husband's son, to secure the succession. Then she formed a partnership with Struensee that gave her intellectual companionship, emotional support, and actual political influence for the first time in her life. When she became pregnant again, she navigated the paternity uncertainty strategically, maintaining enough ambiguity about Christian's possible fatherhood to preserve legal legitimacy, while privately knowing the truth was different. Her fatal mistake wasn't the affair itself. Plenty of royal women conducted affairs without suffering Caroline Matilda's fate. Her mistake was that she and Struensee accumulated too much power too quickly and threatened too many entrenched interests. The conservative Danish nobles didn't destroy her because she'd been unfaithful to the king. They destroyed her because she'd helped an outsider seize control of their country and implement reforms they despised. The adultery charge was the weapon they used, but the real crime was political. The cruelty of her punishment reveals the double standard royal women faced. Christian VII, despite his madness, kept his throne and his children. He was never punished for neglecting his wife, for visiting prostitutes, or for being unable to fulfill his marital duties. But Caroline Matilda, who had done exactly what was necessary to produce heirs when her husband couldn't reliably do so, lost everything: her children, her crown, her freedom, and eventually her life. Her story also raises profound questions about maternal rights and the ownership of children in royal contexts. Caroline Matilda gave birth to both children, endured the pregnancies and labors, and loved them as any mother loves her children. But legally, they weren't really hers. They belonged to the Danish state. When she was accused of adultery, the children were immediately removed from her custody, and she was forbidden all contact. This separation was used as psychological torture, a punishment designed specifically to break her spirit. The message was clear: royal women's bodies might be necessary for reproduction, but they had no rights to the children they bore. The question of Princess Louise Augusta's paternity has haunted Danish royal history for over 250 years. Modern historians agree almost unanimously that Struensee was her biological father based on circumstantial evidence. Timing of conception, frequency of access, physical resemblance, and contemporary accounts, but without DNA testing, which the Danish royal family has never permitted on royal remains from this period. Absolute certainty remains elusive, and perhaps that's fitting. Caroline Matilda's entire tragedy stemmed from living in an era when paternity couldn't be scientifically determined, when women's word about their own pregnancies couldn't be trusted, when political power determined biological truth. She navigated this impossible system as well as anyone could, but in the end, the system destroyed her. If Caroline Matilda had lived in a different era, one with reliable contraception, DNA testing, and women's reproductive rights, her story would have been completely different. She could have avoided pregnancy with Christian, chosen when and with whom to have children, and proven paternity definitively if challenged. But she lived in 1770s Denmark, where none of those options existed. All she had was timing, discretion, and hope that biological uncertainty would work in her favor. It didn't. Today, when we can determine paternity with 99.99% certainty through simple DNA testing, Caroline Matilda's dilemma seems almost incomprehensible. How could an entire political crisis revolve around a question we can now answer definitively in a few days. But that's exactly the point. For most of human history, paternity was fundamentally unknowable with certainty. It was based on trust, timing, and power dynamics. Royal women like Caroline Matilda lived with this uncertainty constantly, knowing that a pregnancy's true origins might be questioned, but could never be definitively proven one way or another. She used that uncertainty strategically, or tried to. She became pregnant when she needed to secure her position, maintained enough ambiguity about the father to preserve legal legitimacy, and gave birth to children who fulfilled her dynastic duty regardless of their biological origins. In a different political climate, with different enemies, this strategy might have worked. But she made too many powerful enemies too quickly, and they used the one weapon that could destroy any queen: the accusation of sexual betrayal. Caroline Matilda died at 23, younger than most university graduates today, having experienced a lifetime of trauma compressed into less than a decade. Married at 15 to a madman. A mother at 16, trapped in isolation for years, finally finding love and political partnership at 19. Pregnant under questionable circumstances at 20. Arrested, imprisoned, divorced, and exiled at 21. Dead at 23. Her daughter, Princess Louise Augusta, lived to be 71, spending nearly 7 decades carrying the legacy of being probably Struensee's child. She was legitimate by law but questioned by everyone who knew the history. She was a Danish princess who was quietly married off and moved away from Copenhagen as quickly as possible. She was living proof that royal legitimacy was ultimately a legal fiction maintained by political power, not a biological reality determined by genetics. The question, who was the father, dominated Caroline Matilda's life and shaped her daughter's entire existence. In an era without DNA testing, without blood typing, without any scientific method of determining paternity, that question could be asked but never definitively answered. All that remained was circumstantial evidence, political accusations, and the whispered judgments of history. Caroline Matilda knew the probable truth. Struensee was almost certainly Princess Louise Augusta's biological father, but in her world, that biological truth mattered less than the legal fiction that had to be maintained to protect the monarchy. So the question remained officially unanswered, a secret that everyone knew but no one could prove, hanging over her life like a death sentence waiting to be carried out. In the end, she paid the ultimate price not for becoming pregnant by 3 different men, the title of our story, but for the possibility that she had. Whether she was actually intimate with multiple men or just with Struensee while still occasionally fulfilling marital duties with Christian is almost beside the point. What mattered was that in her position, as a queen expected to produce heirs with a husband incapable of reliably doing so, the line between duty and desire became impossibly blurred. She did what she had to do to survive, to fulfill her role, to find happiness in an unhappy situation. And for that, she lost everything. Remember that candle-lit palace chamber we imagined at the beginning. The fear, the uncertainty, the knowledge that the pregnancy inside you could either save you or destroy you depending on whose child it was. That was Caroline Matilda's reality for months. She carried that secret, managed that uncertainty, played that deadly game. For a brief moment, it seemed like she might win. Children produced, position secured, power achieved through her partnership with Struensee. But in the ruthless world of 18th century royal politics, a woman with too much power and too many secrets was a target waiting to be destroyed. Caroline Matilda learned that lesson in the cruelest way possible. Her story isn't just about forbidden love or royal scandal. It's about the impossible position of women whose bodies were political property, whose pregnancies were matters of state, whose personal choices could trigger international crises, and whose questions about paternity could never be safely asked, let alone answered. 250 years later, we still don't have absolute certainty about Princess Louise Augusta's paternity, though we have strong circumstantial evidence. Perhaps that's fitting. Caroline Matilda lived and died in that uncertainty, and maybe her daughter's ambiguous parentage is the most honest monument to a woman who navigated impossible choices in an impossible time. If this story of royal scandal, paternity crisis, and a young queen destroyed by love and politics moved you, please leave a like and share this video. Comment below. Did Caroline Matilda deserve her fate, or was she a victim of an impossible system? Subscribe for more deep dives into royal history's most shocking and forgotten scandals. Thanks for joining me on this journey into the Danish court's darkest secrets. Until next time, remember, behind every crown is a woman whose story history tried to bury.